So we're really excited as we've got someone outside of Swinburne joining us today. So Dr. Guy Prochilo, he's from ISN Psychology and is also doing research at the Mind and Body Wellness Research Unit. So he completed his PhD at the University of Melbourne, and his current research focus is on electronic health interventions that are designed to reduce psychological stress and improve well-being. So today we're very fortunate that we'll be hearing Dr. Prochilo to talk about open science practices and how we can apply open science reforms to our research. So yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for that nice introduction. So I don't use Microsoft Teams very often, so I need to figure out how to share my screen here.
Yes. I think it's the little white square with an arrow facing upward.
Yeah, so I'm just using a Mac, so I need to give permission to look at my screen. What that means is I'll just need to pop out, pop back in. I'll be back in just a minute time.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, should be ready to go now.
Perfect. Yes, we've got two of you side by side at the moment.
Okay.
So I'm just going to see if I can just spotlight. There we go.
All right. So just showing my screen. Can you see that yet at this stage?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, let's get started then. So thank you for the invite today. It's very good to be here today to talk to you about open science and to share some of my tips and tricks on doing open science yourself. So today I'm going to speak on a presentation I've thrown together. The future of science is open. 3 ways you can apply open science reforms to your research right now. So 3 things that you can do today, 3 things that you can go home. Well, I assume you're already at home since we're all online at the moment, and actually do today with respect to applying open science to your research. So I have a nice introduction there, but I'll just reintroduce myself again. So my name is Dr. Guy Prochilo. I completed my PhD in psychology at the University of Melbourne. And I'm currently a lecturer and researcher at the private college, ISN Psychology. So we only teach psychology students there, psychology undergraduate and psychology postgraduate students. I'm responsible for coordinating the research methods units. So I teach advanced research methods and statistics to both the honours cohorts and to the clinical master's students there at ISN. And I also supervise my own honours and master's students. And this supervision research currently focuses on electronic mental health interventions using RCT methods. So these interventions that are conducted online or maybe in your pocket on a smartphone app that are designed to reduce stress, improve well-being, and maybe even improve certain aspects of performance, like study and work performance. If you're a Monash alumni or involved at Monash in any way, you might be familiar with the Monash Mindfulness for Wellbeing and Peak Performance program, a very popular online mindfulness electronic health intervention. So it's very, very popular, but actually has no evidence that does what it claims to do. So it claims to reduce stress, it claims to improve well-being. It's never been subjected to a randomized controlled trial at any time in the past. So me and my students got together and we've subjected this to a randomized controlled trial, also applying open science practices to this research. All the data will be openly available. People will be able to independently reproduce my analyses. Everything's out in the open. So hopefully that comes out later next year at some time. And I'm also the Australian and New Zealand Open Research Network and Zone representative at my college at ISN Psychology. So I've had a bit of influence there. A lot of the research program at ISN now follows a lot of open science practices. For example, in completing your ethics application, in completing your human ethics application, you must specify that you will deposit your data to an online repository for the betterment of human knowledge, and so that your findings are completely transparent and reproducible, or give a sufficient justification for why that is not appropriate or why you cannot do so. If you want to get in touch with me, here's a few different ways to do so: my work email, my website, and also I'm quite active on Twitter. Although I've not been active over the last month because it's marking season. For a lot of students, it's study season. It's been a very, very busy month indeed, and I'm very happy for it to come to an end. So here's a bit of the structure of what I'm going to go over with you today. So first, we're going to cover what is open science. What is this thing I'm talking about? Open science reforms. Then we're going to talk about why you should care about open science. Some of these are, so why you should care with respect to the betterment of science, why you should care with respect to not wasting the public's money. These are real world, these are really idealistic things that you would want to aspire to. But then I'm going to talk about why really you, as an individual, you as a researcher, you as a future researcher, should care about open science. What do you have to get out of it? Open science requires you to do all these extra steps. You're a busy researcher, you're busy with your studies potentially. Why should you invest the time that could be invested elsewhere to do these open science practices? Well, I'm going to tell you that there are many reasons to do so. And we'll get to that in that section of the presentation. And then we're going to go over 3 very explicit ways you can apply open science reforms to your research right now. Things that you can do today, things that you can go home and begin applying to your research from today onwards. So without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, what is open science? What do I mean when I talk about this thing called open science? There are many definitions of open science, and some scholars who are very much into open science, they might disagree with the definitions given by other individuals. But what I like to do is, when I define this tricky concept, is first define what is not open science, because this really throws into a really stark relief what do we mean by this concept of open science. Getting hit by a paywall. This is not open science, and this is something that I assume that almost everyone here today has experienced at some point in time. I know I personally experience it almost on a daily basis. You are looking for a research article, you find something, the title in abstract matches your research agenda to a T. Maybe it's something that will help you develop an argument in your thesis. Maybe it's a paper that describes a method to do something very much more efficiently than you've been doing at this stage. Maybe it's essential to progress with your research, but you're hit with a paywall. Well, obviously, most of us here will have university subscriptions to journal databases, so we can eventually get beyond this paywall, but it's also not a very efficient use of your precious research time. Having to navigate through hoops and hurdles through the library to get this. Maybe the library doesn't even have it. There is no university that subscribes to all journals that exist. It would be prohibitively expensive, so maybe they have to order it in for you, stalling your research. Or I guess the alternative, we all live in the real world, I'm not going to beat around the bush, is to pirate it, which has ethical implications associated with it. So going to good old Sci-Hub. So you're likely to experience this on a daily basis. Just like I do. This is not open science. Getting hit by a paywall, things that prevent you or even the public from accessing publicly funded research is not open science. Cannot access data. So this is not relevant. This might not be relevant to everyone, but it probably will crop up at some point in your research career. You cannot access the data you need to do your research. Often you read a paper, this differs from discipline to discipline, and you'll think, this is a really cool paper. It's actually exactly what I'm planning to do in my own research, but they haven't done the analysis that I want to do. They reported all the data. Maybe it's a randomized controlled trial or some online intervention. And you want to see if this is moderated by age or gender or sex or some kind of moderation variable. The data set is there. The data set is there available to run this analysis, but it has not been reported. Yet the data set is not available for you to do this. It's locked in a filing cabinet somewhere, assuming that the researchers who conducted the study have diligent data management systems in place, which often is the case, they do not. So you reach out to request this data from the researchers in question. Most often the case, you'll get no reply. I did this recently. I was requesting data that would inform a study that I'm currently doing, a randomized controlled trial of these online app-based interventions. And I wasn't hit with no reply, but I was hit with a cannot do so for ethical reasons. Cannot share de-identified data for ethical reasons. Really puts a dampener on my research and my ability to do research, and it probably will do so with yours as well at some point in your career. This is not open science. And finally, cannot analyze data, or you cannot easily replicate the analyses of others. So I'm a psychologist. I have a bit of a psychological bias in this presentation. This is SPSS. This is the statistical package for the social sciences. And if you're in a social science, if you're in something like business, sociology, psychology, I'm sure there are other disciplines that use SPSS. SPSS is a prohibitively expensive analysis software. And there are additional add-ons to that software that cost even more money. Often you won't experience the full brunt of this expense because it's covered by you in a university in some manner. But this is a very expensive outlay to universities and sometimes to individuals for those universities who did not provide it. And especially if you have to do additional analyses that go beyond the standard SPSS provisions. This is not open science. So what is open science? We've talked about what is not open science. I've given you 3 key examples. Now let's give you a clear definition of what we mean by open science. And the definition that I like to follow, which I think is quite neat and tidy, is that by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And they define open science with respect to 3 key criteria. And as you'll expect, they're the inverse of the examples I've given in the last 3 slides. Open science is about providing unhindered access to scientific articles. There are many ways to do this. You can publish in open access journals. You can also post preprints of your work or postprints of your work to dedicated archival repositories. And we have 2 examples of the PsyArchive, which we use quite commonly in psychological science, as the name suggests. We also have the bioarchive for biology. There are many, many archives that exist. By submitting your papers to open access journal articles, journal venues that don't lock your article behind a paywall, or submitting preprints or postprints to these repositories, you are increasing access to science more broadly. Open science is about providing access to data from public research. So, calling on my example, not able to get data. Data is available on request. This is not good for science. This is not an efficient way for science to progress. It's not good for also having confidence in the findings of published research if you are not able to independently replicate those analyses using the same steps that they've used in their paper. There are many ways to provide access to data, and we have two examples here on my slide, the OSF, which we'll discuss in more detail in this presentation, which stands for the Open Science Framework, which is an online repository where you can store your data, and you can also apply a DOI, a digital object identifier, to your data so it becomes a citable object, potentially increasing the amount of output in your research career, creating valuable resources that can be cited by others. And we can also use GitHub, which I've used on occasion. It's a online software for managing Git, and often used by in programming and web development as a method of what's the word I'm looking for? Just keeping track of the progress of the development of a software. You can also use this to store data. You can use this to store the analysis scripts that you've used to analyze your data. Open science is also about increasing the ease of collaboration across researchers through the use of open digital tools. So we had the example of SPSS. SPSS is definitely not open. It's very, very popular, very, very expensive. It's fairly powerful, but there are open source and free alternatives that increase the ease of collaboration amongst researchers if they don't need this expensive layout, and of course, which are free to use. And we'll discuss two today. We will discuss largely R statistical software, which I use for my own research, free and open source analysis software. And that's a bit scary for some people. Writing code's a bit scary for some people. So we'll also discuss what is called GUI, which is an open source GUI, graphical user interface for R itself. And it looks very, very much like SPSS. So if you're scared about leaving SPSS, GUI is a nice stepping stone to leaving the tight, icy grip that SPSS has on the social sciences generally. So we can see that open science is comprised of three main criteria. We have open access, providing access to research that we conduct, making it easy for people to access that research. We have open data, making sure that the data that we present alongside that research is open, available to scrutiny, available to be independently verified, available to be used by other people in ways that you may not have envisioned for the betterment and development of human knowledge and science more broadly. And also using open source, so increasing the ease of collaboration amongst individuals, amongst researchers, reducing the costs of collaboration and the cost of doing science. So these three things together, these are essentially the basis of what is open science. Essentially broadening access to scientific publications, broadening access to data, increasing the ease of collaborations amongst individuals through open source software is at the heart of what we refer to as open science reform. So reforms to the way we do research based on these open science principles. So now you should have a fairly good idea of what is open science. You probably have a good idea of why, or developing a good idea of why open science itself is fairly important. Now let's get into why you should care about open science if you're not already convinced. And we'll discuss some broad idealistic things that open science brings about with respect to improving human knowledge, ensuring that knowledge is transparent and reproducible, and reducing the costs and waste of public money on science. So let's get into it. Open science reduces costs. Open science can reduce research costs to both individuals and institutions. Here we have an example from the University of California. This was published in Vox just a few years ago, I think 2019. Here, the cost of academic publishing is absurd. The University of California is fighting back. They've just dropped a $10 million a year subscription to the world's largest publisher of academic journals. They've dropped their subscription to Elsevier, one of the largest academic journal publishers in the world. This is a staggering amount. You can imagine what you can use or what the university might do with $10 million. You have if you're not assuming that they use it correctly, it can be used to improve the learning experience of higher research students to quite a bit. We can invest this in libraries, we can invest this in library resources. There's probably a lot we can do with $10 million that is currently being directed by lots of universities to subscription to journal articles. And the whole reason for this is that the model of publishing that is predominant in science, at least in psychology, I think it may be different for things like physics, but most of the sciences, we basically do our research, which is funded by public money. We submit it to a pay-per-view journal. Once it's accepted, it goes behind a paywall, and then nobody can access it unless they subscribe to the journal or they pay a fee. In a journal, and then you are no longer affiliated with a university in the future that has a journal subscription, you're going to be locked out of your own research, which is kind of crazy. But this is the way of the world. This is the way of science. A lot of money goes into maintaining access to these very, very much closed repositories of scientific knowledge. It's getting so expensive that no university in the world can afford to subscribe to every single database that exists. It's simply not, it's simply untenable to do so. The costs are spiraling out of control. Open science, if we were to publish our data, or we were to publish our papers in open access journals, or we would simply publish preprints or postprints that we'll discuss a bit later in online repositories, this would dramatically reduce the cost of doing science, perhaps redirect that money elsewhere to better your student experience and also the ability to do research. Open science also promotes verification of findings. And I'm not sure how relevant this will be to people who are joining us here today, but I've heard horror stories where students have based their PhD thesis on the findings, well, not their entire thesis, but a few studies on the findings of prior research, and they've not been able to actually replicate their findings. There are many reasons for that, and today we're just going to mention reproducibility, which involves reperforming the same analysis using the same code and protocol. And for this, you need access to data of the original papers. Open science promotes more verification of scientific results. If this data was all out in the open, you can simply go to that data, reproduce that analysis. If you're not able to get the result that the original people got, not going to waste many months, years on a research endeavor, trying to extend upon this or reproduce it if it doesn't reproduce on the original data set. When the data and code generating analyses are unavailable, this prevents research reproducibility. And essentially, a lack of transparency decreases the value of research. And basically, when you publish in a closed access journal, when you don't provide the data, you're saying, trust me. Trust me, I'm a scientist, I know what I'm doing. Trust me, everything checks out. Trust me, and you can trust me. It doesn't always check out, especially when it comes to things like statistics. As a researcher, you're expected to be everything at once. You're expected to be able to read the research literature. You're expected to be able to teach usually. You're expected to learn how to analyze data, especially in psychology, be an amateur statistician. You're expected to be able to follow these steps correctly in your analysis software. Often something goes wrong. Often there can be mistakes in your analysis. Shouldn't be something to be ashamed of, but you should throw it out there so it can be reproduced and verified by others in your field. Here we have an example from Iqbal and colleagues who did a some meta research in the field of biomedical literature, field of biomedical science, looking at reproducible research practices and transparency within this field. So they did a very large survey, took a random sample of 441 biomedical journal articles published between 2000 and 2014. And actually only one of all these studies provided the full protocol, and none made the raw data directly available. So this is not a very good outcome for the biomedical sciences. Reproducibility is potentially a concern. So open science promotes more verification, it promotes more trust in research. It also, if you can verify findings that you want to build on it, you're going to waste less time. Open science reduces research waste. So open science makes it easier to reuse existing data sets and to test new hypotheses. This allows us to avoid duplication of research efforts and the wasting of often public money. So I mentioned this example earlier. I'm not sure how relevant it is in science that goes beyond psychology, but often in psychology, we don't do direct replications of studies. We don't try to reproduce the steps exactly of this research and see if those findings are borne out in our replication. We usually try to replicate it with an extension somehow. So introducing some moderator variable. Is the relationship observed in this data set, does the magnitude of this relationship change direction or change strength based on the introduction of this moderator? Is the difference between psychological stress in a treatment group and a control group in a randomized controlled trial, is this moderated by age? Does the effect differ based on someone's age? Does this differ based on someone's sex? Does this differ based on someone's level of financial well-being? Often, but not always, this data is actually being collected by the original data set, by the original research, and the data there is available to you to test your hypothesis. You just need access to this data set. So instead of going out, running your own study, collecting participants, using a lot of money, using a lot of time, using a lot of resources, you can actually test this more efficiently with that data set available to you to reuse. And there are many places that data can be stored for reuse. I've been collaborating with Monash University recently, so they have their what's called bridges. You just have a different name, but I forget what it is right now. But their bridges repository usually contains all papers published by people working at Monash University, but also can involve publications of protocols and also raw data sets. So Bridges is one example. I'm sure most universities have access or have their own version of Bridges. I'm sure there is one here at this university as well. So open science reduces research waste. So you might be thinking at this stage, yes, it's all very, very interesting. It's definitely good for not wasting other people's money. It's good for meeting these idealistic expectations of science. Everyone should have access to research. Everyone should be able to read whatever is published. But maybe you're thinking, I'm a busy student, I'm a busy scientist, I'm trying to learn statistics, I'm trying to do research, I'm trying to publish papers, I'm trying to skill up. I just don't have time to incorporate open science practices into my work. So let's have a look at some things that could benefit you directly. Some more, I guess, self-serving things, some more selfish things. How can open science help you as a researcher put food on your table? How can it help you progress your career? How can it help you feed your cat? And I'm not sure where my cat is. You might be wandering around in the background of my camera somewhere. But yes, essentially, how can open science benefit you individually? First of all, you will get more citations and you'll get more attention. Scientists love citations, scientists love attention. So in general, on average, open access articles where you either submit your paper for publication in an open access venue, or where you either post a preprint of your work or a postprint. And when I say postprint, you've already published your paper in a closed access journal somewhere, and you've simply submitted your Word manuscript, not fancy format like the journal does, but this is available somewhere as a postprint on a repository. Open access articles receive more citations over time. And basically, we all know the adage, publish or perish. We also need to get citations on our work to progress the academic ladder. Open access can help you do this. So here's a study by Wang and colleagues. It's getting a little bit old now, so I'm probably due to update the research in this slide, who looked at the open access advantage with respect to citations. We'll focus on citations here. So here's a nice representation of their plot of open access and non-open access articles from the years, over 2 years, from 2012 to 2013. Open access here is represented by the orange columns, non-open access by the green, and here we have the relative citation rate, open access compared to non-open access, where higher scores favor open access being cited more over non-open access. So for example, in the January to April 2012 aspect of this plot, open access articles had on average 18.37 citations, and I should mention that this was in Nature Communications across a variety of disciplines and involved almost 2,000 articles altogether. Open access articles received on average 18.37 citations, whereas our non-open access articles received about 12.1 citations on average. And the rate of citations, open access compared to non-open access, was that open access articles were about 1.5 times more likely, they were cited at 1.5 times the rate of non-open access articles. You can see, obviously, this will decline as we get closer and closer to the date that this analysis was conducted. But typically, what this data shows is that as publication history gets longer, open access articles have a citation advantage, and this becomes more apparent. So if you were to publish 2 articles today, one open access and one non-open access, they may get a similar amount of attention over the next year. But as time goes on, your open access one it's easier to access, easier to find, easier to download. It's going to get more citations as the years go by, assuming that this data, that this trend will hold in your area of research as well. Open access articles receive more citations across different disciplines. So here we have some work done by McKernan and colleagues on how open science helps researchers succeed. So how it helps you progress your career, how it helps you put dinner on the table, how it helps you give your cat a better life. So let's break down this plot here. The x-axis here represents the relative citation rate of open access compared to non-open access articles, calculated by the mean citation rate of open access divided by the mean citation rate of non-open access. So what this means is that higher scores that are more to the right of this plot, are those favoring open access over non-open access. And this y-axis here represents the discipline. And I've singled out a single data point, which I recommend you do whenever you're giving presentations that involve plots so people understand what you're talking about. Again, I have a psychology bias, I'm a psychologist. So here we have psychology singled out. We can go over to the data point here, and we can see that for psychology, open access articles are cited at over 2 times the rate of non-open access articles. So there is a definite open access advantage in psychology, and this differs across different disciplines. So this data set actually is an aggregation of many reviews across different disciplines. So where you see more than one dot point here, it's simply the results of 2 separate reviews that McKernan and colleagues have aggregated together. So in psychology at the time, there was only one, and this gave a open access advantage. For other disciplines, there was more than one. But you can see that the general trend is that most of these data points are here to the right of our plot, to the right of this one value, which would mean that open access and non-open access were cited at the same rate. We can see that most here support the fact that were you to publish your data, or were you to publish your paper in an open access journal, or were you to provide it openly in some venue, like a preprint or a postprint, you will have a citation advantage across most disciplines. The size of the advantage, of course, depends on the specific discipline. Again, another selfish reason for wanting to do open science, more citations, publishing your data, publishing your papers openly will give you more citations and more attention. Open access articles receive more attention on social media platforms in general. So in this study by Addy, they aggregated data, again, across Nature Communications, across a variety of different disciplines. And they found that across all articles that they examined within this 2-year period, 2013, 2014, open access articles, here represented by the light blue columns, were likely to receive over twice as many unique tweets compared to non-open access, here represented by the dark blue columns. If you publish your data, if you publish your papers openly, potentially also publish your data, you're more likely to get more attention on social media. If you're not already aware of the Twitter community, there is a very big academic Twitter community, and I recommend getting involved in that. It's a really good way to meet new people, to develop collaborative arrangements with people. I have some collaborations that I would have only came about to be if it was, or only came about to be because of Twitter itself. It's also a nice discussion to be a part of. So look into academic Twitter. look at the hashtags PhD chat, hashtag academic Twitter, get involved there. It's also a good place to share your research. When you publish an article, it's not the end for you. You need to get it out there. You need to get it read by people. By advertising it on social media, it helps do that as well. And if your data and your papers are open access, they're more likely to receive more attention, more shares, more retweets, more discussion on your work, which is what we all really want. We want citations and attention to progress our career. We want citations and attention to essentially stay scientists. Open access keeps you accountable to yourself. Publishing your data and code keeps you accountable to yourself, and it helps you avoid disaster. This is, I guess, what they're saying here is the approach I take to my own research. Do research that your own worst enemies could not fault. Basically, throw it all out there. Throw out your data, throw it out to the general public to be able to look at your data. Throw out your code, publish this somewhere, make it available to scrutiny. This, if you're not already a diligent researcher, will make you an extremely diligent researcher. Because if you're doing this, you want to make sure that everything is done correctly, that your analyses are correct, that your code is correct. Put it out there to be scrutinized by people. Do research that your worst enemies could not fault. Open science keeps you accountable to yourself, makes you a better researcher. Submitting data and research materials to independent repositories also ensures preservation and accessibility of that content in the future. A lot of us are trained as scientists in different disciplines to do certain things, and not a lot of us are trained to manage data, to manage databases, to ensure that something we do today is available in 10, 20 years' time. So submitting your data and research materials to an independent repository ensures that you'll never lose this data, helps you avoid disaster, and it keeps it accessible for people in the future. So again, just highlighting the Monash Bridges system. It used to be called Figshare, and I just found a random article last night which provided a full open access data set. So these individuals, Francis and colleagues, I believe this is the work of a PhD thesis. They provided all their data open, available to be scrutinized, available to be used by the individuals. It has a DOI attached to it, so it's also increasing the research output of this individual and also increasing the amount of citations you potentially can get across your work. Open science keeps you accountable to yourself. And finally, or almost finally, open science helps you save time in the long run. Learning open source data analysis tools will help you save time. At the very start, it won't be saving you time. It will take up a lot of your time. But as you get more proficient with things like R statistical software, you'll learn how to do things like automating analyses. You also make your research much more reproducible. So if you need to, for example, show something to your supervisor, show an analysis that you've conducted, you don't need to go back and do step by step, click by click. You can simply run a code and have that generated before their eyes. So learning these tools, very slow at the beginning, but can help you save time in the long run. And basically, all of this helps to build your reputation as an honest and careful researcher. If you're throwing your data out into the public to be scrutinized, if you're throwing your analyses out into the public to be scrutinized, if you're throwing your code out, if you're making everything open and accessible, completely transparent, you're building your reputation as an honest and careful researcher. And we're in an age where there is more research being published than there has ever been in the history of science. There's more and more being published every day. How are you going to distinguish yourself from this huge wave and mass of research that's being published every day? Why should someone read your work? Why should someone start your work compared to someone else working in your field? This is one more good way to build your reputation, build your brand as an honest and careful researcher. People will trust your work. People will be gravitated to your work and will want to read it and build upon it. Open science can help you build your reputation. So hopefully you're thinking, well, this seems like a lot of work, but there are a lot of positives potentially that I could get out of doing open science, publishing open access, learning statistical software that is open source and freely available. So I spent a lot of time trying to convince you that open science is important. Spent a lot of time trying to explain that open science can help you in your career, help you put food on the table, help you progress to be the fantastic scientist that you're aspiring to be. Now let's get into 3 easily implementable ways that you can apply open science reforms to your research right now. What can you do today? What can you do when we finish this presentation to get started on open science yourself? Or maybe what can you do to start convincing your supervisor or your research lab that you should be moving to open science practices? These are 3 things that you can do potentially today. These 3 things will be guided by the 3 key criteria of what is open science, open access, open data, and open source. So we'll go through these one by one. How can you do something with respect to open access today, open data, and open source? Let's get into it. Starting with open access. First, you can post a preprint or a postprint of your work. So what is a preprint? I mentioned this word a few times. It's a scholarly or scientific paper that precedes formal peer review. So it's something you throw out into the open before it's been formally reviewed by peers in your field and before it has formally been accepted as a publication that becomes part of the peer-reviewed literature. Often preprints are given in a non-typesetted format, so it's not been copy edited to look really, really pretty like the journals do. You simply get your Microsoft Word documents, export that to a PDF, and make it available on one of these preprint repositories. A really good thing about this is that preprints can establish scientific priority if you have a certain idea that you came up with. And to avoid getting scooped, you can post this to a preprint repository, which will be assigned a DOI, a digital object identifier, giving you precedence of this idea in a way that can also be cited. You can also post postprints of your work. So postprints refer to, oops, where'd my screen go? Postprints is simply archiving articles that you've already published, potentially in a closed, non-open access journal, after they've been published. So you're archiving these somewhere. You're not using the typesetting that the journal article has done to make your article look really, really pretty. This is actually owned by the journal itself. You'll be in infringement of their copyrights if you wanted to post this somewhere online. But there's usually nothing stopping you from posting the accepted, non-formatted version of your manuscript on something like one of these preprint repositories. You can publish in your fancy closed prestigious journals, and let's not beat around the bush. Some of us need to do this. Some of us, or the state of what science is at the moment, it's not a completely viable option to just publish in open access journals. Often the really fancy, prestigious journals that are going to get you ahead in your field are closed access. They're very old, very prestigious. you can still do that, but you can also post a postprint of your work on one of these repositories to make it openly available to everyone. And not all open science researchers agree with this, but I do very much like this idea, and it's the idea espoused by McKernan and colleagues in 2016. Basically, publish wherever you want, publish in a closed access journal if you want to, but archive openly. Make the work easily available to people to read, even if you're publishing in these closed access journals. So a variety of archives here. Archive if you're in psychology, the Eng archive if you're in engineering, the Agri archive if you're in agricultural science, and so on. And we have the original as well, the archive, which is mostly for the physical sciences and mathematical sciences. Much longer history of using archives compared to other disciplines, including my discipline of psychology. So let's just give a bit of a preview or a rundown of how the site archive works. They all work basically the same. A lot of them are actually hosted on what's called the Open Science Framework, so they all should all look very, very similar to one another. So I'm going to jump out of my lecture slides for just a moment, and we're going to go to the site archive here. So just Googling site archive, we'll come up with a site archive preprints repository. I'm logged in as well at this stage. So you can sign up to this preprint repository. If you're in psychology, it's probably relevant to you, but if you're in a different discipline, have a look at the repositories that are relevant to you. We can click this button here, and we can simply, oh, actually that's just the main page. You can browse through preprints and postprints of work that might be relevant to your research and your field. Often this is quite interesting and quite good to do because it represents the cutting edge of research in your field, the research that hasn't yet been formally peer reviewed, the research that's probably going to come out in the next year or so. So let's have a look in clinical psychology. This is mostly where I work. I'm not a clinician myself, but I work very closely with clinicians. And all my research is clinical focused. So you can go through these. Let's find my current research is on mindfulness. Let's look for the cutting edge research in mindfulness, and I want a mindfulness RCT. Register report and pilot trial. Meta-analysis. Meta-analysis. Here we go, randomized controlled trial. So browsing this repository, you can find the cutting edge research in the field. Everything that you submit to this repository is assigned with a DOI, so it becomes a citable object, and whatever you've given submitted here, you get precedence over it. Your ideas have precedence. You thought about this first. You submitted this first. This was your idea. Potentially, it's just making its way through the publication pipeline. So we can see that this is not typesetted in a nice, pretty manner that we're accustomed to reading with respect to published journal articles, but it's published in the manner that you would submit your article to these journals as a Word document. And you can go through and have access to this research straight away. So to submit a preprint, again, this will be very, very similar across all the repositories because they're mostly based on the Open Science Framework. They're all hosted by the Open Science Framework. You simply click submit a preprint. You can upload it from your computer. Here's that McKernan article I was reading yesterday to prepare some of today's work. I'm actually going to post it as a preprint. But essentially, you upload your work, give it a title name, say to continue, and then you go through the ropes of each aspect of publishing this preprint. Public data available. There's a big push for making data available. So yes, you can link to the data itself. Is this pre-registered? We don't cover that today in today's seminar, but you can also register your protocol for your study. You can register your hypotheses, and you can put this up somewhere in a public database for everyone to see, to make sure that you're not kind of cheating when you analyze your data. You're not dredging your data, looking for effects where some might not exist. You've actually pre-specified your analyses, and you can give a link to where that exists and so on. And you give the abstract, you describe the authors, and eventually you submit the preprint. It will become a citable object that will remain on the preprint repository. Again, you can do this with work that hasn't yet been published. You can also update the work over and over and over again until it is published, and have a postprint here available if it's not available through your preferred journal venue. So let's have a look at my preprints. I think I have an example to show you. So here I wrote a commentary on a field of research called organizational neuroscience, basically talking about how the researchers in this field are not often following good statistical practices or ignoring the implications of research design and statistics and just accepting findings based on face value, mostly based on what's written in the abstract or published articles. But if you read them, if you read these papers in more detail, often the analysis and interpretation tends to fall apart. So here is the final accepted publication. The journal in question that I submitted this to allows you to post the final formatted version to a preprint repository because it's also open access. I retain your copyright over my work. And you can also see how this changes over time. So if it was initially a preprint, like it was back here in version 1, we can see the original article I submitted before it was published. You can see also how this changes over time. So posting a preprint, if you're planning a study, or if you have one ready to publish, you can post a preprint, get feedback on this from the broader scientific community, establish precedents of your work. If you already have a published study that's behind closed access doors, you can also consider posting a postprint. So simply not the formatted version, not the fancy formatted version of your work, but what you submitted and what was accepted for work in that journal. Of course, check with the journal guidelines to make sure this is appropriate and that you're not impeding on some copyrights. So you're not making any copyright infringement. Let's jump back to my slides now. So that covers the site archive and more generally archives that are available across disciplines. Let's go to the next thing that you can do. You can also publish your data openly. So open data. What you can do is deposit your data, code, or study protocol to a public repository. Or if you're not ready to do so yet, if you're planning a study, you can start, you can create yourself a profile on the Open Science Framework, the OSF, and start documenting everything as you go along. What is your study protocol? Providing a nice, neat Word document describing the protocol of steps that goes beyond the procedures and methods section of your potentially published work. You can write up your code before you've actually analyzed your data and make this available. If you're ready to deposit your data, assuming that you have ethical clearance to do so, So if you're working with human data, make sure that your participants consented to providing, to allowing their data to be openly made available. The OSF is one place where you can store this data for yourself. So I'll just show you the OSF as well. Jump over here to the OSF. We'll go to OSF home. Might be just taking me to the dashboard because I'm logged in. So if you navigate to the OSF, osf.io, this is what you'll be presented with, a place to share your research. It's a free open platform, so you don't have to pay for it, and it supports your research and allows collaboration. So there are a lot of things that you can do with the OSF that go beyond what I can present here today. For example, you can upload data that is not able to be publicly made available. So you can have a private OSF profile. And if someone requests access to your data, if they've given you a reasonable request, you can simply send them the link and they can access the data there. So it's good, a good way of managing your data as well. So I won't go into the steps of signing up, but you can do so yourself and have a bit of a look at the OSF in more detail. I also use it to manage my student projects, my honors student projects, because it's part of our criteria of honors theses and master's theses. That data must be deposited to the OSF, and that link must be made available in the preamble of an honors or master's thesis. So here we have some students of mine. Let's click here. This is the Mindfulness for Wellbeing and Peak Performance randomized controlled trial I conducted in 2021. I own the project itself. I have a bunch of collaborators, all my students here. And if we scroll down, my students for their individual projects have submitted information relating to the study protocol, the results, and the raw data set itself, and also the materials they used as part of their theses. So this can be much more formally done as part of a project that you make available, and you can also link to it as part of the publication. So just focusing on data though, we'll go down, down, down. And luckily with this data set, it's not available yet, but it will be made openly available on the OSF, the identified data, because I have permission from my participants and clearance from my ethics committee. Here's an example, simply data. You'll be able to verify my analyses. You'll be able to use my data set for your own research. You'll be able to extend on this data in ways that I couldn't imagine potentially. You might aggregate this data as part of a massive, I think it's called a mega analysis that uses, which is a very fancy version of a meta-analysis that aggregates findings across many studies together. They have access to the raw data to calculate whatever they like for that aggregation of data. To show you something a little bit more formal, we'll go here, my project for the effects of a mindfulness massive online open course. This is me setting up the OSF project that will go alongside my randomized controlled trial of Monash's mindfulness program. Currently, I'm the only contributor. I've assigned a certain copyright, assigned it the Creative Commons non-commercial copyright license, so you can use anything I submit to this repository in any research, so long as it's not for profit. And I'm asking people to cite the article, or how to cite this article as well, how to cite this repository. And here we can go down to under the files, under the OSF storage. We can create new folders, potentially folders for data, folders for the analysis output, folders for materials, folders for the study protocol. This will all be available once I am finished marking and once I submit this to a journal article. Eventually, it'll be openly available for anyone to scrutinize, for anyone to look at my results, for anyone to replicate my analyses as well. Impossible to share your data. There are ways around this. So you may not have ethical clearance to share your data on an online repository, especially if you're working with human data. It can be sensitive. You might not have permission from the participants to share their data openly. What can you do? If you're really, really keen and you want to support open practices as much as possible, you can actually create a synthetic data set. So a synthetic analog of your data using this R package called SynthPop. And you can create a data set that retains all the observed relationships between variables in your data set. So this can be really good if you want to post, if you want to create this synthetic data set, you can still post your data set and people can independently verify whether the code works itself, which is another important aspect of open science. So you can create synthetic versions of your data set. Obviously, it retains anonymity of your participants because it's not their real data. And this can be made available on the OSF as well. Finally, let's get into the last aspect of this presentation, open source. What can you do with respect to open source? If you're using something like SPSS now, it might not be worth your while changing in the middle, or if you're too progressed in your postgraduate research. I don't recommend changing, for example, just a few months out or a year out before you're due to submit. But if you're still very early on, these are really, really important skills that will go beyond your research career or your research degree and may also make you more employable. So we have specific tools here. R statistical software is a data analysis tool, and we have RStudio, which is a user interface for interacting with R, which extends R in certain ways. These work together, and you can write code, you can write reproducible analyses, you can automate analyses, produce really, really pretty plots. It's an extremely powerful software, and when you learn to use it well, you can make your work look very impressive. You can do analyses that are not standard in the common statistical packages like SPSS. It can really, really help your workflow. But this does involve a lot of coding. Coding is not everyone's cup of tea. So we also have this very, very nice and fresh and modern graphical user interface for R itself called Jamovi. Not everything in R is available in Jamovi. Researchers make specific add-ons, but Jamovi is very, very well resourced and probably covers most of what you want to do with respect to your research. And it retains this comforting spreadsheet-like appearance. Now, I'll skip over this a little bit, or I might just go through a bit fast because this is more relevant to psychology. I'm not sure we're on all the diversity disciplines we have here today. So why do we use SPSS in the social sciences? Basically, it appears to be very, very user-friendly. It's consistently taught throughout undergraduate psychological science and in a lot of other sciences. For example, I taught SPSS when I was a tutoring business research methods at the University of Queensland. So I do know it's used beyond psychology as well. Essentially, we're all familiar with it. This is why we tend to use it. But the popularity of SPSS may be in decline. Dr. Robert Munchin has a live article that he updates on a fairly regular basis, tracking the popularity of data science software across a variety of disciplines. So the more popular a scientific software package is, the more likely it will appear as a scholarly publication as the analysis tool used by that publication. So here we have a plot of his data in 2018. So he scoured Google Scholar and he's plotted all Google Scholar citations that mention a certain statistical software in 2018. So this is not discipline specific. This is across all potential disciplines. The x-axis represents the number of articles available in 2018, and the y-axis represents the data science software category. And here we have in 2018, over 80,000 articles have actually cited SPSS statistics. So it's a very, very, very popular data analysis tool going well beyond psychology itself. And here we have R at number 2. Although SPSS is the most popular, there is some evidence that potentially its use is declining, while the use of other alternative softwares are increasing. So the same researcher here has aggregated all data from Google Scholar from 1995 all the way to 2018. He may have updated it more recently. And this general plot indicates a particular decline for SPSS and an increase in use of our statistical software. So let's just break this down. The x-axis here represents year, 1995 to 2015. And the y-axis is the number of citations to a particular software. SPSS, this red salmon color, we can see that SPSS, the number of citations of this software increases, peaks here around a bit before 2010, and has rapidly declined ever since. Whereas something like R, given by this brown triangle here, we see a slow and steady increase over time. So make of this what you will. This data is correlational. It's cross-sectional data aggregated over time. There may be other reasons behind the trends we see here. Maybe there's just a general decline in the tendency to cite software in general. Maybe people who use R are more motivated to cite R and say, yes, I use R, whereas people who tend to use SPSS are less likely to mention SPSS in their papers themselves. So there are alternative explanations that may explain these trends here. But let's go to another source of data. We have discussion forum activity, which is another measure of popularity of data science tools. The other plot here represents the number of people on the x-axis that follow topics in LinkedIn and Quora. And the y-axis here represents the statistical software in question. So we can see that the majority of people, the vast majority of people across LinkedIn and Quora are following topics that relate to R. SPSS here is coming in here in third. R seems much more popular across these two databases. The lower plot here represents the number of questions and threads about a certain statistical software on cross-validated and talk stats. And here we can see that the vast majority of questions relate to R, whereas SPSS is trailing quite a lot as a second here. Again, this is correlational, cross-sectional data. There may be other reasons explaining these trends here. Maybe R is just harder to use, so there are more questions about it. But across these different aspects of evidence, there seems to be a general decline in SPSS use and an increase in use of R. and an increase in the popularity of R relative to SPSS. So one take home from this may be that if you were to stick with something like SPSS, you might just get left behind. So it might be good to work and worthwhile to start investing in something like R today. R and R Studio are extremely powerful. They can do every analysis that you'd want to do and then some. There are many packages that you can install to R that have been written by statisticians or applied researchers themselves, and allows you to do things, basically anything that you want to do with respect to a certain analysis on your data. It does have a very big learning curve though. If you don't have experience coding, it'll be slow and painful, but I can promise you it will benefit you at some point in the future. And unlike SPSS, there are many free and excellent resources available to guide you through your R and R Studio journey. So here we have the R for Data Science book itself, which is free for you online. So you can follow this book to help you get started with R, and also the cross-validated Stack Exchange community is very highly, has a lot of support for things that are done in R as well. So I do recommend, if you're interested in R, get started today. Just try to code something. It will be slow, it will be painful, but it will pay off as time goes by, and there are lots of nice resources here to help you out on your journey. How would you use R and R Studio as part of an open science data analysis pipeline? Well, here we have a very simple set of steps, and if I have time, I might just show you this in R itself. So create what's called an R Studio project in R. If you share a folder with an R Studio project in R, you can share it with anyone, and everything will be pointing to the correct directory, which is really good. R Studio projects are a great resource to take advantage of. Create a new R Markdown document, a document that allows you to write R in a nice and pretty format. Import your data, write your code, what we call knit the document together, and you'll get a nice report of your data analysis. And if you upload this to something like the Open Science Framework, anyone can download your script and follow these steps and reproduce all your findings. So let's just see if we can get this running. Assuming you've installed R in R Studio, you can add it to your taskbar here, or go and navigate to where it's installed and open it. And this is what R and R Studio looks like. R Studio is an IDE that allows you to interact with R. Don't use R by itself. I recommend downloading R Studio as well. They go hand in hand. And what we can do is set up our new project. So I'm going to go to File, New Project. I'm going to create a new directory for my research, new project, and I'm going to call this Mindfulness Randomized Controlled Trial. And I'm just going to save it to my downloads, but please never do this. Save it somewhere more relevant, because you're likely to clear your downloads at some point in time. Create the project. And here we have our Mindfulness RCT R Studio project. And if we navigate to your downloads folder, or where you've saved it, here you have the new project folder, Mindfulness RCT, and here you have the rproj file in R, which will open up your R project. And what it will also do is point all your directories to this specific folder. which is really helpful as well. So I got some demo data, and I'm just going to copy and paste that into my single folder. So a good idea to have everything just stored in a single folder for your analysis pipeline. I have my mindfulness data. I've just simulated this data for today's presentation. Let's go through it. We have our ID variable, participant 1, 10, 11, and so on. Which group do they belong to? 1 or 2. Plausibly, this is a treatment group and control group. We've measured an outcome variable. In psychology, we call this dependent variable at time point 0. So our baseline measurement in our randomized controlled trial and our post-test measurement in our randomized controlled trial. We have some missing data. And we have some other variables here like age and sex, both measured at baseline. So going back to R, we can create what's called a new R Studio. A markdown document, file, new folder, R markdown. And this can be your analysis pipeline. Press OK, and we have this new document here. Currently, it's untitled, so it'd be good to save this. And I'm going to call it analysis pipeline as well. So here is what's called a markdown document. Whatever you write inside these little quote marks here, starting with R, ending with these quote marks. This is the code that you run. Whatever you write outside of that code will be stuff that will be written to a document that you can knit together. So just as an example, we can knit this example document together by clicking this knit button. It creates a nice set of outputs of all the analyses that you run for your research. So this can be saved as a HTML file. You can also save it as a PDF. Quite handy for sending it to your supervisor to summarize all the analyses that you've done. And also handy to upload to the OSF so that people can independently just run this document. They can just knit it together and get all your analyses done all simultaneously at once and as an R Markdown document. So we'll just delete some of this for the moment. Probably only have a few minutes to spare. But the typical way that you might do this, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import libraries. And I'll just write that. So this will be whatever's given by a hashtag will be given as a title in your knitted R Markdown document. We can create a new, what's called a code chunk, Control Option I or Control Command Option I on a Mac, and you can start writing your code here. So importing my libraries, and so on. Because I'm running out of time, let's copy the analysis I did earlier, just to demonstrate to you the power of R Markdown and what you might use it for. So here I'm reading in my data, the mindfulness data in my CSV. This will be imported into R itself. I'm fitting an analysis of covariance model. Is there a difference in the covariate adjusted post-test means? I'm plotting the data, and then I'm doing a pairwise contrast to calculate the effect size of interest. Let's knit this together. Fingers crossed it works. Always a bit of a worry doing these things live. And there you have a completely reproducible set of analyses that you can upload to the OSF. You can upload this code. You can upload this entire folder that you've made with the R Markdown project, your data, and the code that you've done to use to analyze your data. And you can scroll down here. Here's where you've imported the data. Here's where you've analyzed the data, the code you've done to fit the COVA model. It's warning me because I have some missing data. I'm just throwing out, doing a complete case analysis. I plotted the results. Here you have a nice pretty plot of the covariate adjusted post-test means of group A and group B. And I'm also calculating the effect size. So on average, group 1 is scoring 6.02 units lower than group 2 on our outcome variable. And we have a confidence interval here in our p-value for this contrast. So this can go straight onto the OSF, allowing your data to be openly available, allowing all your analyses to be completely reproducible. I think I might have to skip Jamovi just for time, but just note, learning R in RStudio is very, very frustrating. You're going to have moments where you completely hate it. You're going to have moments where you're kind of embarrassed to share your code with others because you know it's fairly amateur, especially at the early stages. But know that any code is better than perfect code. You don't need to do this perfectly. Don't be ashamed of uploading your code to the OSF, even if you're not happy, even if it's not perfectly formatted, as long as it works. That's the important thing. And as long as it's adequately documented. Not everyone wants to code in R, so we do have SPSS's user-friendly analog, Jamovi, which is a GUI for R. Unfortunately, I'll have to skip that for today, but this is also something to look into if R is not your cup of tea, or if you want to gradually get into open source analysis software. Jamovi is a really good stepping stone. It can do basically anything that you want to do, or most of us want to do. It covers all these analyses, and there are also plugins written by statisticians and applied researchers that you can add to Jamovi itself to make it even more powerful. So just skipping over this, finally to finish up my presentation or my seminar, what can you do to get started today on open science? You can submit, download, read, or even cite a preprint, get involved in preprints, get involved in postprints, make an account on a data repository like the OSF, get started creating projects in the OSF, get a feel for uploading your protocols, maybe even uploading your data, and also download an open source and free software like R. I really recommend getting started with R, or Jamovi, or some alternative maybe that's more used in your discipline. And just remember that any code is better than perfect code, especially if you're starting your journey with R. Here are my references for today. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Guy, for that presentation. That was really informative and really quite practical. I think you really impressed upon us the importance and the benefits of embracing open science. If anyone does have any questions, please do free to just speak up, or if you prefer to just type them in the meeting chat. All right. Well, actually, I've got a question, Guy. So I'm in the cogneuro field, and certainly some of the disorders that we look at in our lab, there are very few studies which have use neuropsychological methods to examine certain things. So the data is really at a premium. So I can certainly see the importance of open science, both in access and in the data. There is, I guess, some sort of a hesitancy, I think, at the same time there about, protecting the data. It takes quite some time to build up. Do you see in the future in sort of those sort of disciplines, open science becoming much more openly embraced?
Yeah, I think there's a general trend for all sciences to move in that direction, especially the psychological sciences. So I think that eventually we'll all have to do open science. And I think also there's a lot of grant bodies that specify that open science practices should be followed. And some of these have open data provisions. So as this becomes more and more common, I believe it should be more common in your field as well. Another thing that I do admit is that you spend all this time, you spend all this money and resources collecting data. You might not just want to throw it out there in the open. You might not want to do that straight away anyway. And I think it's perfectly fine to have an embargo on your data. So I've collected this data today, and I'm going to upload it to the OSF, but I'm going to put an embargo on it for the next 2 years because I want to work on this data set for the next 2 years. I want to get as much value out of it as possible before I make it completely open access. So I think that's a completely fine thing to do. Different open science advocates might differ with their respect to that, but I think it's perfectly fine to embargo your data until you're done with it. It'll be open eventually. You've invested the money, so you might as well get what you want out of it before it's out there in the open.
Great, thank you. All right, looks like we've got a question from Amanda. What's your thoughts on using the conversation as a way of engaging in open science?
Using the conversation? What do you mean by that? Sorry.
Yeah, so could you just clarify your question there, Amanda?
Hi, yeah, sure. Sorry. The conversation is in the public kind of forum that is available to researchers with like journalists, and you write an article kind of together based on the research that you're doing. Because I'm kind of asking from a standpoint of I do psychological research, but very kind of community-led psychological research. So with like vulnerable migrant communities who, don't have access to journals, don't have access to the research we're doing with them, essentially, once it's done. So I was wondering about, your thoughts of using like blogs and things like the conversation to kind of still engage in open science.
I think the conversation is quite a really important resource, and there are a lot of open science articles on the conversation. I think it's a good way to get the discussion happening and out there into the broader public who may not have as much of an understanding on this topic. But I'm just not too sure what you mean with respect to, so do you mean communicating findings of research with the people who the research is about via the conversation? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, instead of like a preprint, because like we're having this kind of ethical, not really an ethical dilemma, but more like the way we write the research article may not be particularly that good for the layperson, especially the layperson that maybe English isn't their first language. So how we're writing the research article is a bit like medical jargony. So, but we still want to engage in open science, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, blogging about research and writing these kind of distilled the conversation articles about your research is important to increase the accessibility of science more broadly, especially for people who might not be trained or willing to read articles. I think it comes hand in hand, though. Make the article available if people want to read it. Also a good idea to write an article about your article in lay terms to increase accessibility to that information as well. Mm-hmm. So I think they do go hand in hand.
Great.
All right, thanks, Amanda.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And Guy, I just had one other question. You raised the honours projects that you're involved in and embracing open sciences. Is that a conversation that you have with your honours students once they I guess begin that journey?
It's less of a conversation, more of an expectation. It's just the way that we do things at ISN Psychology. It's part of the procedures and protocols. So when I get my students to submit an ethics application for their research, they need to justify, or they need to describe how you're going to make your data openly available at the completion of this project. I think it actually mentions, are you going to put this data onto the OSF? If they are not, and there are legitimate reasons why students might not do that, not in my research group, but other groups who are working with sensitive data, or if they don't have the ethical clearance to do so, they just need to justify why they cannot do that. But at the end of the year, when they submit their theses, we generally have a group, if I have a bunch of students working on the same overall randomized controlled trial, we'll have a group OSF profile with different folders for everyone, and they'll submit their data to their folder, they'll submit their analyses, they'll submit a description of how to reproduce their analyses as well, and they need to provide an open access link in their thesis as well, so that the thesis marker can look into the OSF and see all this information there for them as well. That was just part of our policies and practices at ISN Psychology.
Cool, thank you so much. All right, now were there any other questions for Guy? All right, didn't think so. All right, well, once again, on behalf of HeSSA, thank you so much, Guy, for coming along and presenting to us today. That was really informative and really interesting. I'm sure we all learned a lot.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And we'll be releasing the recording as well, I believe, like via email for everyone who might have missed it. All right, great. Thanks so much, everyone. Cheers.